people connecting with the call. I just want to make sure that we allow everyone an opportunity to sign on. I'm really thankful that you've chosen to join us. Welcome to the third to the last Wings for Widows community Zoom call this spring. And I hope you are enjoying spring. Here in Minnesota, can't decide whether it's going to be spring or still a little bit of winter. We had snow in the air yesterday, so I'm hoping it's warmer than that where you are. Thanks for taking this evening away from your activities to join us. I'm Leanne Lorian. I'm one of the many volunteers who bring this organization to life, and we're really thrilled to be a part of so many people's lives and helping them take the next step in their journey after the loss of a spouse. We have 2 more seminars this spring, May 5th and then May 19th. Those will be really good topics. The first one is on how to honor your loved one on those difficult anniversaries, anniversary of their death, birthdays, wedding anniversaries. What do you do on those days to both honor your loved one and not spend the whole day crying? And the second one is, I think, a great one to launch you into summer, and it's on the topic of living intentionally. And I think we all need some direction in that area, especially now as things seem to be opening up a little bit with COVID. Just know that people at Wings for Widows, all of us volunteers, feel a deep sense of calling to care for you in practical ways. And we really want to share your story and help you write your next chapter. And we really appreciate it if you would tell other people that you've met about Wings for Widows. Thanks to COVID, we are a national organization. Anyone who speaks English can be a part of us. So far, I don't think we have anybody that's bilingual, but we are very happy to serve wherever you live. I want to spotlight our spring enrichment classes, which are also available to anyone. The first one starts in just a few days. Chris Bentley will be teaching our legacy planning class. And during that class, it's a 6-week class. You'll learn how to plan your own will, how to set things up so that your family can easily follow your roadmap at the end of your life. And the other that starts on May 2nd is Denise Gibson's class on consumer protection. And the third that starts May 13th is on grief explorations, and that's our ongoing grief class. Tonight we have a wonderful lineup of speakers that I'll introduce in just a moment. Please keep your mute button pressed. That's the reason why. Because sometimes we have background noise, and it also helps with the internet connectivity. So do keep your mute button pressed and use the chat button at the very bottom of your screen. It looks like a little word bubble from a cartoon if you want to ask a question, because that way I can field those questions as time allows at the end of each of our speakers' talk. Our call will last about an hour, and it is being recorded. So within a couple of weeks, that's edited and posted to our website. I hope you'll be able to refresh or let other people know about it, and they can listen to it at a later date. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Melissa Brennan. She is speaking to us from Texas. She lives in Plano, Texas, and she's one of our first, or our newest, I should say, financial coaches with Wings for Widows. One of just 3 female coaches that we have. She's a certified financial planner, and she's on our volunteer roster because she has a calling to work with widows. She understands that beside the overwhelming grief and loneliness of losing a spouse, there's also financial challenges of settling the estate and taking on new financial responsibilities. She loves the role of being a shepherd, walking clients through the transition and watching them grow in confidence, ultimately feeling empowered to take control of their decision making. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you very much for coming with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to do my first community event. So I have one comment and one caveat. I am from Texas, and Texas is known as a community property state. And we also have very easy, very inexpensive probate here. So if something I say doesn't go with your experience in your state, certainly go with the advice of your particular estate planning attorney or your financial planner, because estate laws vary from state to state. The second thing is, if you find yourself doing one of these things, no guilt. My motto is know better, do better. So there's nothing on here that can't be corrected. So this is a list that I've compiled in my brain for over the last 20 something years of working as a financial planner. And the biggest thing that I see with women, and particularly widows, is that they don't trust their gut instincts when it comes to working with their existing financial planner. Many widows change their advisor after a death, and a lot of that has to do with the influence of others. They're relying on other people who are giving them advice because they love them and they want to help them and they want to be proactive. But at the same time, that advice really may not be the best advice for you. The scariest thing for me as a financial planner, because I've been doing this for a long time, my community is very tight, is that I know how different people work. And I hate it when somebody becomes dislodged from me or my firm to go somewhere that I think, oh, that's going to not be a great fit and not going to work out in the long term. Widows do this a lot because they don't trust their judgment, because when you're grieving, your brain is taking up so much of its capacity to process that grief that it purposely makes you lose other things out of your consciousness. So you may not remember tasks, you may not have good memory, you may not even have great comprehension. You may be thinking, you know what? I know what all those words mean, but not together and not in that context. And those are all completely normal experiences. So don't discount your judgment just because your grief state is different from your normal state. If you know, like, and trust your advisor, don't make a change. Now, if you're not sure, you've been somebody who's been disengaged from that relationship, as a lot of spouses are. Usually there's one financial spouse and there's one non-financial spouse. If you've been that non-financial spouse and you're not engaged with that financial advisor, schedule some meetings and have some really candid talks. I encourage my clients, say whatever you want, ask whatever you want. Don't worry about how I'm going to take it, because it's not about me, it's about you. And let's get those questions answered. And if you have those candid meetings and you're still not feeling like you know, like, and trust that person, that's the time to make a change. The other time I see widows making a change is when they get remarried, particularly if their first spouse or their decedent spouse was the one who was the financial person. Sometimes we're kind of anxious to offload those tasks that we perceive as the other spouse's responsibilities back on that person. I know for me, it's anything technical. I tell my husband all the time, I have lots of insurance on him because I need a lot of help if something were to happen to him, because there's just certain things I can't do. The second thing I see is that sometimes women, especially widows, will seek advice from the wrong person. So, for example, I have often had widows come to me and say, well, I've got this, issue. And so I asked my friend Steve what he would do, because Steve is a multimillionaire. He's built this enormous business, and I feel like he's going to give me good advice. And Steve may give you good advice, but he may not, because his problems aren't your problems. And so he may have no actual expertise in the field that you need it. So if you need specialized expertise and you don't know who to ask your trusted professionals and they'll connect you. They've got a network of people that they can call on, and they'll make sure that you get the right advice. The third thing I see, and I don't see this as much in widows as I do with people who have lost either a child or a parent, is substituting some other activity. Sometimes it's spending, sometimes it's a hobby, for grieving. And that's really, it's kind of like a meditation technique almost. When you're having a panic attack, you aren't able to stop your brain, but you can distract it. You can count, you can take a physical meditation break. There are lots of things that you can do to pull your brain out of that activity. But with grief, even though you may substitute some other activity, that grief doesn't go away. So it's really just a temporary short-term solution. The fourth thing I see is what I call starving the estate. And this comes from a place of love. So a lady has been through a terrible experience. She's gone through this huge transition, and just the thought of that is stressful. And she wants to make it easier for her kids. So she gets a little hyper vigilant about putting beneficiary designations on all of her assets and all of her accounts. Because in her mind, she wants stuff to go straight to her children and that's it. But what she's not thinking of is that even though she's gone, there's still going to be final utility bills, phone bills, doctor bills, and there's going to have to be a final estate or final tax return filed. So if there's no money to do that, that doesn't excuse the executor from being responsible for those tasks. So then the executor has to go back to the children and say, I'm really sorry, but can you give me back some money so that I can fund the estate and take care of these expenses? Oftentimes, what I do with my widows who are anxious to get money distributed before the estate is completely closed is we'll get all the bills paid and we'll estimate what the taxes are, and then we'll keep a pretty good slug of money in there just in case, and then we'll distribute the rest. So the heirs don't have to wait until the estate is completely settled. They have access to their inheritance, but at the same time, we make sure that we're not short on cash. The other thing that I see is we as women sometimes make accidental gifts, especially as we get older. When a single lady starts to get older, it's not unusual for her to rely on one of her children, probably one child more than others, probably the closest and the oldest female. It's not uncommon for her to want to take that daughter to the bank and add her to her bank account so that somebody has access to her funds if she is hospitalized or if she has to go from the hospital to a lengthy rehab. But the problem is she may actually be making an accidental gift to that child. So that child's creditors then become her creditors as far as that joint account is concerned. And if she were to die, that account may transfer to the daughter as the co-owner instead of going through her estate and being divided and distributed according to her will. It's okay if you want to have somebody help you with your money, but the better route to do that with is through a power of attorney. The sixth thing I see is sometimes widows don't get their husband's name taken off of all the investment or bank accounts. It's really common. There's a lot of, some spouses leave a lot of loose ends and, things get overlooked. And so make sure that you give a final look, even if you have to take a break, just give a final look and make sure that all those things are addressed. Because if you don't, then it's going to be harder to settle your estate if there are still assets in your husband's name. The seventh thing is not saying no. And this is really hard for us as mothers, saying no to our children. But remember that you don't have to make decisions based on what somebody else wants. And their timeline doesn't have to be your timeline. I was talking to a woman earlier in the week who just really didn't have the capacity to plan the funeral. And with isolation and COVID, it was this big ordeal. And she felt very pressured by her family members to get it done, get it done. And, that's really, she's the primary person who is grieving that loss. So, I told her, just take a breath and take your time. You don't have to be on someone else's timeline. Get things done as you feel like you can get them done. The eighth thing is that widows sometimes don't want to update their estate or their financial plan. And so that usually comes from one of two places. Either one, they're overwhelmed. They've just been through a whole big ordeal and they just want it to end and they want to get on with their life and they don't want to deal with anything technical, unpleasant, or complicated. And so they procrastinate. The second place that comes from is bag lady syndrome. So bag ladies are those ladies pushing the shopping cart with all their possessions in shopping bags in that grocery cart. Now, men never are afraid of being a bag man. I never have had a man say, oh, I'm really worried about running out of money. 99% of my female clients, regardless of how much they have said to me, I'm afraid of running out of money. But remember that your financial planner is your solution finder. And we like you and we want the best for you. So if we're running a plan for you and it's not looking good, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to say, okay, so this isn't working out the way that we thought these numbers would work out. So let's talk about some alternatives. Let's talk about what we can change and what's acceptable to you to change so that we can make you feel hopeful about the future and not afraid of the future. And then the sister to that is not updating their estate plan. And this happens most frequently when there's a trust involved. It's not unusual if I get a new client who's a widow for her to maybe have settled all of her husband's affairs, but she never actually implemented the estate plan that's in the trust document. So she still may be holding assets in the revocable living trust, and it should have gone to a spouse's trust and maybe a bypass trust. So that's really common that people don't actually then implement the estate plan that they have. So you want to make sure that whoever you're working with, who's managing your money, has seen either that will or that trust document and knows what's going to happen. Because I can tell you that most people are a little fuzzy on those details, but we have the benefit of working with a lot of people and a lot of trust. So it makes more sense to us, and we can make sure that you are doing everything that you're supposed to do according to that trust. Because again, if you die and those things aren't done, then it becomes a problem for the next generation. And the final thing is commingling assets. So even though Texas is a community property state, you can maintain separate property, but that separate property loses its separate property status if assets are commingled. So if I open an account with my second husband and he makes a contribution to that account and I make a contribution to that account, I'm commingling what could have been separate assets. So make sure that before you do that, you think that through and that you talk to your estate planning attorney and you talk to your financial planner, Because commingling may be perfectly fine. If neither one of you have children, may be perfectly good to commingle accounts. But if you have children from a previous marriage, he has children from a previous marriage, that can get really bad really quickly. So it's good for everybody to know up front, okay, how are we going to follow the trail of assets, my assets and your assets? And then how can we maintain those traceable trails, but still make banking and investing easy on ourselves? So those are my top 10 that I've seen in my practice. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I'm watching number 5. One of our listeners would like you to explain that again.
Okay, so this is one of those things that happens frequently in a community property state. And so if you're in a common law state, you may not run into this. But if you're in Texas and you open a joint account or you add somebody on as a joint tenant to your account, that account is assumed to be owned as joint tenants with rights of survivor. So if I open an account and I put my daughter onto that account as a joint tenant, she's automatically going to be the co-owner of 100% of those assets. So if something happens to me, those assets go directly through her instead of going through probate. It also means if she's not responsible with her finances, her creditors can attach to that joint account to satisfy her debts.
Another question, how do you keep assets okay with your children in a new relationship? I'm not quite sure I understand what that means. You
Well,
mean the widow has a new relationship or the kids have a new relationship?
usually sometimes there's a problem when the widows have a new relationship. And I completely am 100% for family communications. My mother died when she was 29. My father died when he was 55. At both of those deaths, you think when you're settling the estate, well, why did this person do this way? There's always those questions. I don't understand what they were thinking. And so I really like to have family meetings. And so if you're exploring getting married to remarried and your kids are concerned about that, then let's have a family meeting with or without the fiance. And let's talk about, well, what are your concerns? Are they addressed in the existing estate plan? In what ways are those addressed and you may not know it? Or do we need to go back and have some thoughtful conversations with that fiance to determine how we need to proceed going forward so that everybody knows what's going to happen when mom dies?
I have one request for you to just give the 10 bullet points over again.
Oh, sure. Number one, not trusting your gut instincts about your existing financial relationship. Number two, seeking advice from the wrong people. Number three, substituting spending or hobbies for grief. Number four, starving the estate. Number five, making accidental gifts. Number six, not taking off your husband's name from bank and investment accounts. Number seven, not saying no. Number eight, not having your financial plan updated. Number nine, not having your estate plan updated. And number 10, commingling assets with your next husband.
Thank you. Yeah, some of these things may be slightly different in the state you live in. So do check with somebody that really knows the laws in your own state, so that you don't make an error unintentionally. But that was really helpful because there are some areas there that I didn't think of the implications of.
I know,
You do
because
what
you're
you think is
thinking,
the right thing.
yeah, I want to make things simple,
And
and you don't know what you
right,
don't know.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So just leads to, somebody else asked, do you always need a lawyer? Well,
Um,
I was gonna say it depends.
it depends. Yeah, it really depends. Are you talking about when somebody dies and you're settling the estate, or are you talking about doing your estate planning?
They're not specific in this question, but maybe we'll update it. Um,
Everybody
my
needs
guess is, yeah, go ahead.
everybody needs an estate planning attorney to do your estate plan. Please don't go and get a form off of the internet or think that you can do it yourself. I had a sweet CPA that I worked with for a number of years who thought, well, I've looked at enough trust, I can draw up my own trust document. It created a huge problem because the language wasn't correct. So you do need an estate planner, because they're also not only going to do that will, but they're going to do things like create those powers of attorney. And when those powers of attorney kick in, they're going to go over your HIPAA so that you have a HIPAA release so that somebody can get medical information when they need to. And they're going to go over your living directives. You know, do you want to be kept on life support? Do you want a DNR? You know, all of those things require an attorney. And the packages, if you're working with a financial planner, your financial planner is going to be able to connect you with an estate planning attorney who can do that for you at very reasonable cost. So when I'm working with my clients, if I know somebody has a complicated estate, I'm going to send them to one person. If I know they just need the basic documents and need in and out under $1,000, then that's this person over here. And so that can help you weed through your options and get the kind of, you know, help that you need. You don't always need an estate planning attorney to help you through probate.
I was gonna say, Melissa, you have just given the best commercial you could have given for Chris Bentley's legacy planning class, because I know they go through all of these things and would specifically answer the questions for you it's in a group setting, but you go through a workbook and then you know when you need to have an attorney to actually formulate those documents. Some of it you can do yourself and other things you can't. But you go through everything. And, you know, it's hard to think about for us who've just lost a spouse, but someday it'll be our turn. And we do need to have our ducks in a row for the sake of our kids and our family. So I think that's, it just makes all kinds of sense to think those things through as soon as you can. So with that said, thank you very much. It's really practical stuff. Really appreciate it. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Maureen Revak is the Director of Business Development for Ascensus. And for more than 25 years, Maureen has trained and consulted on retirement planning, IRA issues and operations, and delivering customized training solutions for retirement plan professionals, financial advisors. So she is very well versed in all matters financial, but on the other side, she also is a widow and was a very young widow when her husband died very suddenly, right at Christmas time, leaving her to raise two young kids by herself. I'll let her tell her story, but she has been one of the key volunteers for Wings for Widows almost since the beginning. And she currently serves on our board and with our clients as a paraprofessional. She is a very wise woman, and I'm very thankful to know her. So thank you, Maureen, and welcome. Maureen's going to talk to us about her journey with grief and grief groups.
Okay, well, thank you, Leanne, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk about my experience with grief groups, with the hope that maybe you can take something that I've learned to determine if and when participating in a group might be a beneficial part of your journey. So as Leanne said, my husband died young. He died 11 years ago at the age of 46. Died of a sudden heart attack while playing basketball. Our kids were 10 and 12 years old at the time. And in the days after his death, I remember just wanting to read about other people's experiences with sudden death, how they dealt with it, how they helped their kids deal with it. It was such a unique experience to be widowed at 45 and just to be widowed, period, that I read everything I could about it. And I was reading because that's all I had access to. I didn't know any other young widows to talk to until I attended a grief group. So I've participated in 3 different grief groups, including a weekend group, a group that was sponsored by the Health and Human Services Department of our county, and then a group sponsored by a local church. Each experience was unique, and while I learned from each one of them, one experience was really a home run for me. And as I go through this, I'll kind of explain why, and that might help you figure out what would work best for you and how to be successful if you do choose to participate in a grief group. So the first experience was a weekend retreat at a place in Wisconsin called Camp Hope. And when you're, newly widowed, you get all kinds of advice, especially a widow of young kids. And so many people were telling me, oh, your kids need to go to counseling. And I'm like, I don't know, they seem okay. Do they need counseling? They're as okay as any young kid can be after losing their dad. But, what if I was wrong? I could screw them up for the rest of their lives. They wanted nothing to do with counseling. And they felt weird enough being, the kids in our small town whose dad had died, because they, we were in a very small town in Wisconsin, and fairly high profile. So everyone knew that their dad had died. They had that stigma. So they really didn't want to be also the kids that went to counseling. But I was worried I was going to mess them up. So we compromised and we did Camp Hope, which is a weekend that's geared towards kids who have lost their parents. And so we drove to the camp. It was a couple hours away. The kids spend the weekend at one camp, and then the parents are at another location. And we're close by, but we're separated. And so I dropped the kids off, and then I went to the parent facility. And remember, I was doing this for my kids. This was, their thing. But I was amazed. I went to the parent facility, and here were other women who had lost their husbands and had young kids to finish raising. And it was so energizing sharing with these strangers. And I just remember thinking, if we only lived closer, because we were from all over the state of Wisconsin, we could get together on a regular basis, but we didn't. And it ended with that weekend. But again, we shared and we cried and we laughed. And it did show me that there was something missing. And, that was something maybe I had to try and figure out how to find. But again, I lived in a small town. There wasn't a lot of access. So that was my first experience. And it just showed me that I knew this could be valuable if I could find the group. My second experience was put on by the county, and it was held in the conference room at the local hospital. And so in Camp Hope, we went to about 3 months after my husband died. So fairly early in our journey, we did Camp Hope. My second experience was about 6 months after my husband died. And it was a group for any type of grief. So they had people who had lost adult children, people who lost spouses. There were adults that had lost parents. So it was quite a mix of different types of grief. I only ended up attending 2 of these sessions. I was busy with work. I worked full time, had a fairly demanding career. And my kids, were 10 and 12. They were in every activity. And so the third session, I just completely forgot about. I still had a little bit of that widow fog brain. And all of a sudden I realized, I missed the third session. And I just wasn't really motivated to go back. I didn't like leaving my kids home alone at night, and getting someone to stay with them seemed like it was more work than it was worth at that point in time in my life. And so I didn't make time for the group. It just wasn't the right time in my life or in my journey. And then my third experience was with a local church. And I had become close friends with another widow. We do find each other in a small town. There was one other widow with kids in high school, in middle school, and she had participated in a group at her church. Didn't really work that first time with that leader that they had, so they decided to try it again with a different leader. And it was a small group. There's only 3 people in that group. Other people had dropped out. And so those 3 really wanted to do this. So they reached out to find other people in similar circumstances. And so we kind of all came together, and we met socially first for dinner at the home of one of the widowers. So the group consisted of 4 widows, 2 widowers, and the parents of a child who had died. So we had 8 in total, 5 women and 3 men. Our facilitator had led Bible groups, but was not a widower himself. So we got together socially first. No one knew everyone, but we all knew someone. And we spent that first gathering at his home. It was a beautiful place on the river, and it was just, we kind of mingled. We all knew why we were there. One-on-one, we introduced each other. We told a little bit of our experience, and then we all got together and got dinner on the table. It was kind of a potluck. We had dinner, so it was just like any dinner party where you knew some people, you didn't know everybody, made small talk. And then after dinner, we went around the table and we shared our stories. And this was really key for the success of this group. I really believe in this. No one got through their story without tears, but we did laugh. And I'm a real big proponent of levity as you're going through this. And that can be a real hard thing sometimes, because when you're just with your friends, and people that haven't gone through and aren't in the same experience, they don't even know what to say to you, much less are they going to try and make a joke or feel comfortable laughing. And sometimes you just need to laugh. And one of my favorite quotes from some of the grief reading I had done was, "If you can laugh through your tears, there is hope." So it was such a release in this group, because we were all having the same experience. So you could joke because you weren't laughing at somebody, you weren't making light of anything because you had been through it, but we were able to smile, we were able to laugh. And as weird as that sounds, grief groups allow you to laugh. You really sometimes can't joke about it. You cry a lot, but they also allow you that levity. And sometimes you just need that to know that you can get through this. So we did laugh. And again, we took a lot of time telling our stories and our backstories and how we had met our spouses. And then we met socially 2 more times at other homes. So by the time we met in the church conference room to start going through our curriculum, we were pretty comfortable with each other. Now we had a book, and we'd read like a chapter a week. And then we'd get together, our facilitator would kind of prompt us with questions. He didn't have to do a lot of prompting, because sometimes we veered way off topic. If any of you have been any part of a grief group, or really any group, book club too, you do that, right? You're supposed to talk about the book and you never talk about the book. The grief group really isn't that different than that. Yes, you have a book, it gets you there. And if you talk about it, great. And if the conversation goes elsewhere, you go with it. You go with where everyone wants to take the conversation. So really not that different than a book group, but you all are coming from this same experience that you really can't find through your normal friend group or your normal book club group. So again, the subject didn't really matter. We just wanted to talk. We wanted to listen and just not feel so alone. And so as much as you don't wish this pain on anyone, it's so comforting to know that others are going through it too. And to me, that's one of the biggest benefits of a grief group. So while my first 2 experiences were fine, the third one really was the home run. And so why did that one work? What made it such a good experience? And I think there's 3 reasons. that really made this one work. And the first is the timing. I was ready for this one. Now, my third experience was 7 years after my husband died. And I know some of you are probably freaking out a little bit saying, oh my gosh, am I really going to be feeling bad in 7 years that I need a grief group? And the answer is no. I was not in a really bad place. I was in a good place. But my youngest son was now a senior in high school, and I was looking at becoming an empty nester. And so, I'd spent the last 7 years so busy just keeping up with my career and maintaining a stable life for my kids that I'm thinking, this may be really different when they're gone and I'm alone, in the middle of northern Wisconsin, and I work from home. I've been doing this whole Zoom work from home for 20 years. That might be really a big shock for me. And I wasn't sure if I'd really gone through the grief process, maybe formally, like I should. And so this opportunity presented itself. And I said, yes, I was ready for it. So the timing was right. The second thing was commitment. I committed to this group this time. Unlike my experience with the prior group where they didn't feel motivated, I didn't make the time for it. Here, I made the time for it. I rearranged my schedule for it. It was a priority. My son knew that Sunday afternoons I was going to be gone at grief group. That was the priority. And in fact, in this particular church, we all signed a pledge of sorts. And it was a piece of paper we actually signed. We just kept it, stating that we would commit to attending every session and we would keep everything confidential. Because that's another big part of a grief group, is you have to be comfortable knowing that it's confidential. And so they do this for all their Bible studies as well. And it's not like if something happens, we all didn't make every session, but the idea was you were signing up that you were going to try, you were really going to commit to this grief group. And I think, that was really important that you make the time for it. And I made the commitment to this one. And then the third thing that I think made this one successful is we really took the time to get to know each other. And I can't emphasize this enough. It really made all the difference. And for the same reason, we didn't allow new people into the group. Several people asked to join after we started. And you hate to say no because someone needs that, and you hate to say no, you can't join. But it doesn't work when you've got people coming in and out of a grief group. You really need to kind of set, here's the participation, here are the members. We're going to commit to each other for 6 to 8 weeks or however long it'll be, and then you stick with that group. As we got people asking about joining, we promised that we would do another one, that we promised that we would make sure that there was another one to follow. And so that's kind of how we dealt with anybody that wanted to join, because you do feel bad saying no. So we became known at this church as the grief group. And if anybody could come up with a name better than grief group, I mean, it does explain what it is, but it's such an awful term. And we tried and we couldn't come up with anything better. But we were known as the grief group, and this church holds probably 10 to 12 Bible study groups every quarter. So 40 or 50 groups, but our group really stuck out, probably because we had the tragedy, you kind of have the big neon sign that says widow sometimes, you feel like. But we were such an eclectic group of people. We were so different. Probably at least 30 years age difference among us. I was the youngest, but the farthest one away from my grief. All kinds of professions, backgrounds, really a different group. People I never would have become friends with otherwise, if not through this group. And sometimes we'd go out to eat after our session. And I know people looked at us in the restaurant because we were such an eclectic group. Our group ended after 8 weeks, and we didn't want it to stop. We had felt, like I said before, a great calling to pay it forward and sponsor or host another grief group. But we found out that the material we used was out of print. So we looked around to see what else we could use, because it helps to have some type of curriculum Even if you don't follow it every week, it helps to have some. But we couldn't find anything we liked. We wanted something faith-based because this was a faith-based group. So we decided to write our own. How hard can it be, really, we thought. I think we just wanted to keep meeting. So it was an excuse, really, to keep meeting. So we put an outline together and we wrote kind of one chapter at a time. There were 3 of us that were the main drafters. And once a chapter was done, then we'd review it with the group. We'd get together, review the chapter. We'd have people add examples to it. And then we kind of talk about, brainstorm for the next chapter. I'm not sure any of us really thought we'd end up with something workable, what we did. And here it is. It's called Grace for the Grieving. And it starts with our stories, because we really felt so strongly that your story is such a big part of your healing, being able to tell your story. And if you recall, all I wanted to do when Chuck first died was read about other people's stories. So we thought, if nothing else, this gave people 8 different stories to read about what happened and how it happened and how they dealt with it. So we started with our stories. And then throughout the book, we have examples. Once you get to know the 8 of us, as we wrote this, then we have examples throughout the book. We are not grief counselors. We clarify that in the beginning of this manual. It was just something that we could use at our church for the next grief group. And that was another part of our healing, I think, was being able to write that. So if you choose to participate in a grief group, what can you expect when you attend one? And every group's going to be different, and they're all, generally will have some type of curriculum. Again, the one we wrote covered an 8-week time frame, and I'll just kind of go through what topics we talked about, just so you kind of understand maybe one might look like. First, we talked about experiencing grief. What is it? What is it going to look like? What to expect? It's a pendulum. How does it? There's no typical journey, but what are the experiences or the emotions you might go through? We had a chapter on extending grace, how to relate and react to other people, how to deal with things people said to us that were maybe a little insensitive. And we had a lot of fun with this one because sometimes you get people that say just the dumbest things, and they don't mean to, they just don't know what to say. So this chapter, we talk about all the things that were said to us, kind of what we wanted to say back, but then how to respond with grace, how to really understand that they're trying and to respond appropriately and deal with that. We had a chapter on struggling with your faith, dealing why God allowed this to happen to us and how that might have affected your faith. We talked about secondary losses, recognizing that there may be other related losses, a loss of income, a loss of friendships, a loss of identity. If you were a caregiver for a long time while your spouse was terminally ill, not only do you lose them, but you lost what you did every day. So we talked about those secondary losses that sometimes we don't necessarily recognize right away. We had a chapter on forgiveness. So forgiving yourself, forgiving God, forgiving the deceased, just trying to get around so you don't carry the bitterness around. We had a whole chapter on finding hope. And this was we just gave examples of where we found hope. There's no, text to this, because how do you find hope? I don't know that I could tell anybody how to go find hope. We just gave examples so that maybe to help people recognize the hope when they does come, that they can actually see it and recognize it for what it is. Chapter about your identity after your loss. How do you start recreating your life? And then finally on keeping the memory alive, ideas on how you can remember your loved one in a healthy and meaningful way. So again, this is just one example of what you might go through. And, there are all kinds of different curriculums. At Wings for Widows, we do have a grief exploration class. I think the next one is starting in May 13th, right, Leanne? And so there is still room in there if you are interested. It is done virtually. I have participated in this one as well. I helped facilitate it, and our facilitator is wonderful. And it's a 6-week session. And it starts with a welcome and introduction. That's the only thing that's done in that first class. So it's that story sharing where we just take the time to get to know each other. And then there's a session on grief in the mind, because there is some real connection to grief and what, you know, your brain and your ability to function in that fog and helping you understand that. She also talks about, you know, grief in the body, how it affects your body. The fourth session is grief in your spirit, in the spirit. Fifth session, we'll talk about when grief gets complicated. You know, is it depression? At what point might you need additional counseling? And then the final one is just continuing the bonds and kind of wrapping things up and what you learned for it. So that's a 6-week session. And in my opinion, the curriculum isn't critical. Don't worry about, you know, oh, I got to find one with a good curriculum or a good book. You know, I think it's more important that you're ready to commit to the group is key, and being open and willing to share, you know, and not everyone in the group is going to share equally, you know, but you need to be able to talk and you need to be able to be vulnerable, or it's hard for the group to connect and it's hard for people to trust if you aren't going to share a little bit. And you will have people, you know, that don't talk a lot, but when they do, it's really meaningful and everybody really listens. And then in any group, there's always someone that overshares or talks too much, but don't worry, a good facilitator is going to handle that for you. Okay. So you don't have to be willing to speak all the time, but you have to be willing to open up a little bit just so that you can connect with everyone in that group. So again, you know, the other thing, if it's not a grief group that you feel you need to go through, you know, a curriculum or a class, there are a lot of just groups of widows and widowers. And if you go to our website under resources, there's all kinds of widow groups that just meet socially. They don't necessarily have a curriculum similar to what we're doing here. They may have a speaker. Before COVID, they would get together socially, and it was just an opportunity to be with other people in similar circumstances. And those you could kind of come and go. They're easier to come and go. It doesn't necessarily require that commitment. But again, you can find that on our website under resources. But you know, really encourage you to find that tribe and to try a grief group if you can. Look to your local church, you know, and again, if you need more resources, come to Wings for Widows and we can certainly help you find one. But make sure it's the right time, make sure you're ready to commit and that you're willing to share and be open and willing to be vulnerable. And I think it could be a wonderful, wonderful experience. The group that I was with in that church, we still get together once in a while. And it was just transforming, really. 7 years after the death of my husband, I had that experience. So any questions?
We do have a couple of questions. One of our listeners asked, how do you find a faith-based group?
You know, again, go to your church. And it was real interesting because at the church where I went, it wasn't my church. It was another church. I was the only Catholic in this group. But one of the widowers had gone to the pastor and said, you know what, you're missing, I need help, you know, and there are several of us that need help. And I feel that this should come from my church. I feel you should be supporting me in this. And there is no support for anybody who has lost a loved one and lost a spouse, and really put it on the pastor's heart to find a solution. And that's how the group that I attended came about. So if you're looking for a faith-based group, don't be afraid to go to your own church and ask, and just say this is a need.
I was going to mention Grief Share. Was my experience. Grief Share is all one word, GRIEFSHARE, just how it sounds.
Mhm.
And you can look them up and then you plug in your zip code and it will tell you, and that is a faith-based group. And it has a video curriculum along with a workbook. and you'll find churches in the area that sponsor a grief share group. And it's non-denominational. So if it's at a Lutheran church, doesn't mean you have to be a Lutheran to go to it. I mean, it's for anybody that wants to, that, you know, if it's in your zip code, they'll give you that reference.
Right.
Now for Maureen, she couldn't do that because she lives in such a small town, they didn't have that. So if you are in a metro area, you probably find a place that has that. It really helped me a lot. I always say I flunked the first time through, had to take it twice. But it was not only what I learned, but also relationships were built there. Someone else asked, do you know of anything for younger people, like your kids' age or 18-year-olds? Do you know of anything, Maureen?
Well, the Camp Hope is, one thing, but that's just a weekend group. I know my kids' school counselors tried to pull a group together. My kids would have nothing to do with it, though. I don't know off the top of my head of any teenage, groups. I don't know if anybody else has had any experience with that. But yeah, I would have to look. I don't know, Leanne, I don't know if you've.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I've had a couple people ask me that, and I wish I did have a good answer, but what I've learned from people who are widows and whose kids are dealing with grief, that they're having a challenge finding good counseling for their kids because of COVID. It's just overwhelmed the mental health system, and there's just a huge amount of need and not enough providers. So in terms of counseling, that's what I've heard anyway. In terms of groups, the only thing I can think of is, I know that Bible Study Fellowship does young adult Bible studies with its co-ed, and I know that they put people together by affinity groups. So if there is a way of communicating that with the leadership, they would potentially put people together who have experienced a loss like that.
Yeah, and Leanne, Kathy brought up Brighter Days Grief Center, and I should have remembered them. They are a great resource, and they do have resources for kids. So thanks, Kathy, for reminding us of that.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's see. And grief share is also for young people. It's not just old people, all ages and all kinds of loss. So
yeah, and you might, Leanne, could someone get grief share at their church if they had someone that I mean, the curriculum's there, so if you can pull a group together at your church and find someone willing to facilitate, I don't know if you have to be trained to facilitate that, or you
I think they do ask for you to be trained, but it is pretty easy because the curriculum, like I said, is videotapes and then a workbook. So it's just, it shouldn't be too difficult, but that's a lot to ask of someone who is actually grieving.
Yeah.
But it is something that I'm just sold on their program. I think it's just the best. Mm-hmm. So yeah, gosh, what is a good time to join a grief group? I mean, how far out from the death?
The only thing, this is going to be so different for everyone, and the only thing I would say is you have to be able to talk through some stuff. Sometimes if it's too soon, it just might be too hard, to get through anything without breaking down. I mean, you're going to break down, and you should break down, and you should cry in these grief groups. But you need to be far enough out that you can, in order to get a lot out of it, you can articulate and you can share and you feel comfortable sharing. But you also have to be in a good space from a commitment standpoint. and, you know, not so exhausted and overwhelmed, you know, if you want to get a lot out of it. And sometimes, you know, it's like Leanne said, you might flunk the first one, and don't be afraid to go again. I did, she did, you know, we had ones that didn't work. Try it. If it doesn't work, you know, try again. I got 7 years after my husband died, I went to a grief group. So it's hard to say that there is an ideal time.
Yeah, I think that gives everyone hope. Not only that, you know, it's not too late. It's never too late. And, you know, life just rolls by sometimes and you feel like you're barely hanging on with your fingernails, and there will come a time when you can take a deep breath and say, you know, now it's time to address this. I know I haven't done it, you know, I haven't done a good job of addressing it in my life. And, you know, there may be times when you need to go back because you maybe took a grief class early on and nothing penetrated, and you need to do it again because it really didn't make any difference because you're just not in that place. So somebody offered that if you go through grief share yourself, then you can lead. I don't know what the policy is with grief share, if you do have to do some sort of training or.
You froze on us, Leanne. So Leanne's had a couple issues with her internet, and I think she's really frozen this time. So I think we are at the top of the hour. We're a couple minutes over, and I know we do try and like to end these timely. And again, we have a grief group starting with Wings for Widows on May 13th. So if you go to our website, Wings for Widows, you can, under Widow Services or under Grief Exploration, you can find that session. We also have in our next Building Community Speaker Series is May 5th at 7 o'clock. And like Leanne said, we're going to present Conquering the Bag Lady Syndrome that Melissa alluded to, and then how to remember your loved one in meaningful ways. So, Dan, is there anything else that we need to cover? I think we've covered it, and I apologize that Leanne looks like she dropped from us, but thank you everyone for attending tonight, and I hope to see you again in 2 weeks. So have a great night. Thanks everyone.